Hello learners and listeners, welcome to this session. Today's topic is United Nations Peacekeeping Mission. This is part 2 of the topic United Nations Peacekeeping Mission. Already we have discussed about how it has emerged as an institution for peacekeeping mission in the previous lecture. This topic is part of the course BGP 003 Conflict and Peace Management. I am myself Dr. G. Uma, working as a faculty in the School of Gender and Development Studies, Indira Gandhi National Open University, New Delhi. Welcome to this session. In continuation of our previous lecture, today we will discuss about the changes introduced in peacekeeping missions over the years and a critical appraisal of the arrangement and its relevance for the maintenance of international peace and security. These are the two main objectives today we are going to discuss. If you listen my previous lecture, you will come to know how the United Nations Peacekeeping Mission as an institution emerged, because when the UN was started immediately after the Second World War, the institution was established for the basically to resolve the conflict in the future. So, in continuation of our conflict resolution, the United Nations thought that it is important to start a peacekeeping mission. This peacekeeping mission basically will be deployed in the conflict zone, and these peacekeeping mission, they act as a buffer institute and they don't side with any parties. Basically they try to bring back the peace in the particular conflict zone. That is the main mission. Second one is that if there is and they try to bring the civility and they try to maintain the peace in the conflict areas. That is the important work of the peacekeeping mission. In continuation of our previous lecture, today we are going to discuss two important things. One is that the changes introduced in peacekeeping missions over the years and a critical appraisal of the arrangement and its relevance for the maintenance of international peace and security. These are the two main objectives in this lecture. First of all, in the previous lecture, we have discussed about how the peacekeeping mission as an institution emerged. In continuation of that, today let us discuss about second generation peacekeeping missions. The end of the Cold War dramatically changed the nature, number and context of the peacekeeping or operations. While only 5 peacekeeping missions were deployed till 1970 and 13 missions authorized till 1988, the next decade, the 1990s, had seen nearly 36 operations authorized by the United Nations. So, if you look at this data, you will come to know that over a period of time, the number of peacekeeping missions deployed in the conflict zone has been increased. So, in the 1970, there are only 13 peacekeeping missions deployed. In the 1990s, there were around 36 operations authorized by the United Nations to maintain the peace, and they were deployed in the conflict zone. The map of the UN peacekeeping missions operating in the decade of the 1990 shows that no region of the world is left untouched. So, if you look at the peacekeeping missions deployed in 1990s, you could able to see that irrespective of the particular region is developing, whether it's in America, Europe, Asia, Africa, everywhere there were a conflict zone, and the conflict between inter-conflict zones or intra-national conflict zones, or there is a conflict between particular regions. So, irrespective of the country located in the particular region, if you look at the map of the peacekeeping missions in the 1990s, every region in the world get affected by some kind of conflict. So the peacekeeping mission were deployed, there were a conflict, and peacekeeping missions will be deployed after having a discussion, after getting confirmation from the particular country. So if the country agreed to deployed UN peacekeeping mission, then only UN peacekeeping mission will be deployed in that particular region. So every continent had one or more missions operating there. The rise of the number and incidence of deployment also meant that some of the principles associated with the original part of 1956 have been abandoned. The second generation peacekeeping operations display features that are different from the original ones discussed already. We have discussed already about the original peacekeeping missions that was established in 1956 in our previous lecture. If any one of you have not yet listened my previous lecture, please listen my previous lecture, then you will able to follow up how the peacekeeping mission has emerged in 1956. The second generation peacekeeping operations are also known as robust peacekeeping, owing to their mandate and the nature of the operations. They have involved in restoring peace in situations of internal conflict, that is intrastate conflict, state building, social reconstruction, civil administration, conducting elections, repatriating refugees, etc. Like these are the activities, basically the peacekeeping missions they were involved, like intrastate conflict, state building, social reconstruction, civil administration, conducting election and repatriating refugees. The initial instances of the second generation peacekeeping missions were in Namibia, that is UN Transition Assistance Group, UNTAG, Angola, UN Angola Verification Mission, UNAVEM, and Cambodia, UN Transitional Authority of Cambodia, and UNTAC. These are the second generation peacekeeping missions, and some of the peacekeeping missions were deployed in Namibia, Angola, Cambodia, and some of these places. One common feature associated with these three missions was that they were comprehensive, often lengthy deployments that included not merely troops but also police, legal and humanitarian contingents. Peacekeepers have come to assume such a humanitarian functions as protection of refugees, delivery of humanitarian aid and rebuilding of infrastructure ravaged by armed conflict. Okay, these are apart from that, they have peacekeeping missions, they involve in certain kinds of humanitarian activities like protection of refugees, delivery of humanitarian aid, rebuilding of infrastructure ravaged by armed conflict. Mostly if you look at these peacekeeping missions, whatever I have mentioned just now, if you look at and if you trace the history of these peacekeeping missions, they were very comprehensive, often lengthy deployments that included not merely troops but also police, legal and humanitarian contingents. They also introduced the notion of transitional peacekeeping, implying assisting nation building projects in the aftermath of conflict. Namibia and Cambodia in their own way signified the establishment of a democratically elected government under the supervision of the United Nations. The difference. Now let us look at the differences. Hence, a new set of rules, that is the second generation peacekeeping missions, the difference we will now discuss. The new set of rules and features have emerged for the second generation peacekeeping operations, which are entirely different from rules that were part of the first peacekeeping plan of 1956. Firstly, the second generation peacekeeping missions are multidimensional in their functions. Their task is not limited to remain stationed at the borders or in conflict zone to repel potential aggression and escalation of conflict. If you look at the difference between the first generation and second generation, The first generation peacekeeping missions are multidimensional in their functions. Their task is not limited to remain stationed at the borders or conflict zone to repel potential aggression or escalation of conflict. So, the second generation peacekeeping mission, they have emerged which are entirely from rules that were part of the first generation peacekeeping plan in 1956. The functions have become diverse as far as second generation peacekeeping missions are concerned, and as also the broad mandate given to them. As mentioned above, peacekeeping forces are involved in civilian and humanitarian functions along with military ones. Secondly, the locale of peacekeeping forces means where the peacekeeping forces are located have shifted from the margins of the state boundary with respect to interstate conflicts to the interiors and center of the conflict area, many times in the middle of the society among the civilians, that is in intrastate conflicts and those leading to nation building. You need to understand that in the second generation peacekeeping mission, the forces were involved in civilian and humanitarian functions along with the military ones. Secondly, the location of the peacekeeping force has shifted from the margin of the state boundary to the interiors and center of the conflict area, many times in the midst of society among civilians, that is in intrastate conflicts and those leading to nation building. Peacekeeping forces are increasingly interacting with civilians, learning to speak their language, win over their confidence, and an effort to build social bridges. This was not foreseen in the 1950s. Thirdly, with the advent of the second generation peacekeeping operations and more diverse set of functions assumed by the United Nations, much of the principle involving exclusive participation of the similar states have been abandoned. Greater functional specialization and demand for logistics have paved the way for the inclusion of personnel from major powers. It is quite common to see American or British personnel participating in peacekeeping operations in the post-Cold War period. Lastly, much of principle of neutrality and impartiality has been shelved to the greater extent. If you listen my previous lecture, when it was started in 1956, even the people who are part of the peacekeeping missions, they were from developing countries and mostly mostly the countries like developing countries, they have deployed their armed forces in the peacekeeping missions. Mostly United Nations avoid taking troops from 5 countries, that is specifically the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, because during that period before Cold War, the entire world has been ideologically divided into 2. One is that socialist ideology, basically they have drawn their ideology from the communist ideology. Another one is that market based ideology headed by the United States. Another one is headed by the socialist ideology, is headed by the former USSR. So after the Cold War, when the Cold War was immediately after the Cold War, so the world has become one. There is no ideological war between 2 factions. So after this Cold War, if you could see that many American and British personnel participating in peacekeeping operations in the post-Cold War period. Lastly, much of the principle of neutrality and impartiality has been shelved to a greater extent. When peacekeeping forces are involved in non-military, administrative and humanitarian functions, their mandate automatically reflects support for a particular ideology, a set of institutions and local groups partnering with them. Eventually, UN forces are seen as supporters of the one group or the other. Perfect neutrality and impartiality of unimpeachable nature is neither possible nor to be expected in administering diverse mandate. The second generation peacekeeping operations have stretched the limits of the United Nations capacity in responding to the crisis situations. Like for example, conflicts in former Yugoslavia, Rwanda have exposed the shortcomings of the world body in resolving complex ethnic conflicts. Similar problems were encountered in East Timor as well. When one of the parties to a conflict is stronger than the others, the UN has found it difficult to obtain consent or ensure respect for its mandate. This is the main problem. If you look at the second generation peacekeeping operations, it has stretched its limits of the United Nations capacity in responding to crisis situations. The conflicts, for example, conflicts in former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, there are like even the world bodies, they could not resolve the problem because it's a ethnic conflict. It is more complex than expected by the international bodies. Like for example, East Timor, like it is difficult for the UN forces to get a consent or to respect the mandate of the international bodies. Both fractions fighting each other, and it is difficult, one are very stronger than the other. It's very difficult for the international bodies to convince the both fighting parties to come to the certain conclusion, and it is international bodies found very difficult to resolve the conflict. If you look at the first generation and second generation peacekeeping operations, let us look at these operations in a critical manner. It is often said that peacekeeping operations have been contemplated only in cases where no major power is interested or where interested powers are not able to impose a unilateral solutions through their military might or otherwise. UN peacekeeping is not even contemplated in situations where one of the parties is strong enough to suppress the rest. It is selectively deployed where UN's legitimacy and credibility is required. Expensive, large, long drawn missions have put a strain on a financial and organizational resources of the United Nations. For example, in some areas, if they are not able to resolve the conflict, the mission has to extend their stay for a long period. It has given so much of financial and organizational strain for the United Nations. And whenever you deployed certain peacekeeping missions, it is United Nations has to ensure that it has deployed legitimately and with so much of credibility. So legitimacy and credibility are very much required to deploy the UN peacekeeping missions. The earliest instance of financial stress due to peacekeeping emerged in 1964 following the operations in Suez Canal and Congo. In fact, when General Assembly authorized the deployment of UNEF-1 and UNOC, Russia and France refused to pay their contribution towards the peacekeeping operations because both of them are permanent member in the Security Council. If they are refused to pay, it is difficult for the UN to take care of the financial strain of the peacekeeping missions. Another problem associated with financial constraints of the legitimacy of the General Assembly to authorize deployments, former USSR and France have argued that only the Security Council is authorized to take action in situations affecting maintenance of international peace and security. When General Assembly acts in the event of deadlock in the Security Council, it undermines the authority of the Security Council and that of the veto wielding permanent members. The entire peacekeeping enterprise has suffered from lack of facilities for training of the personnel for emergency situations and the lack of manpower. In addition to it, absence of coordinating agency has hampered the efficacy of the United Nations peacekeeping operations. Part of the problem has been addressed by the establishing the Department of Peacekeeping Operations in 1992. It is administrative, managerial and planning and preparation responsibilities headed by the Under Secretary General of Peacekeeping. That this department has not entirely resolved the challenges faced by the peacekeeping missions, and the issues still remain. The success of some of the peacekeeping operations have also been sources of the problem. Almost every crisis is sought to be addressed via peacekeeping route. This has seriously reduced the responsive capacity of the United Nations as also its success rate. Some of the peacekeeping operations are also launched without much attention to logistical and cultural details that has been raised questions of credibility. The UN has very little time to train peacekeeping forces before deployment when missions are authorized and deployed in haste. As a result, there is no standard level or organizational or behavioral qualities to be expected from the personnel. And let us look at the developments and reforms. What are the developments? What are the reforms? In response to the criticism and challenges, United Nations peacekeeping arrangement has been several changes and reforms. The expanding nature of the peacekeeping operations in the 1990s necessitated a fresh look at the concept of peacekeeping. The Secretary General Boutros Ghali submitted an agenda for peace in 1992 in response to a request by the Security Council. The report set out broad contours of future action for common security. It defined and established linkages between preventive diplomacy peacekeeping and post-conflict peace building. Agenda for peace discussed such other related aspects as safety of the personnel, cooperation with regional organizations and the problem of financing. It put forward proposal for increasing the working capital fund, establishment of the peacekeeping reserve fund of $50 million and a UN Peace Endowment Fund with an initial target of $1 billion. These are some of the developments and reforms you need to understand. Then Brahmi report was another attempt to address the challenges and suggest reforms. Secretary General Kofi Annan appointed a panel of experts headed by Lakhdar Brahmi from Algeria to suggest reforms and solutions to the problem of peacekeeping. Among other things, report recommended an end to ad hoc deployments, formalization of peacekeeping activities, creation of new information gathering and analysis office to supervise DPKO, and new powers to the Secretary General to pledge advance funding to a new peacekeeping operations. So far we have discussed about the peacekeeping operation, first generation peacekeeping operation and second generation peacekeeping operation, and what are the reforms proposed to improve the peacekeeping operations. So let us summarize the entire two part of the lecture. The term peacekeeping is not mentioned in the UN Charter, as I have clearly mentioned beginning of my lecture in my previous lecture, nor was it envisaged in 1945. It is an extra charter growth. The nature of the United Nations peacekeeping operations has moved from maintaining agreed ceasefire and status quo to reconstructing conflict-ridden societies, from absolute neutrality to taking a political side, from exclusive participation of middle and similar powers to inclusive participation of major powers. UN peacekeeping operations have had their share of successes and failures during both Cold War years and post-Cold War context. Such reforms and rethinking have been attempted to streamline the peacekeeping arrangement. It is widespread use with recurring continuity in varied situations and regions of the world testifies to the fact that it remains the most prominent flagship endeavor of the United Nations in maintaining international peace and security. So far we have discussed about how the peacekeeping missions emerged in the United Nations, and first generation peacekeeping mission, second generation peacekeeping missions, and some of the examples of where the peacekeeping missions were deployed and what are the reforms proposed in the peacekeeping missions. This lecture and my previous lecture, that is part 1, was prepared based on the unit UN peacekeeping missions as part of the certificate program. These are some of the references. Based on these references, I have prepared the lecture. If anyone is interested to learn more about these topics, you can look at these references and you can very well learn further. So, these two parts, United Nations Peacekeeping Mission 1 and 2, please listen, then you will get a comprehensive idea about the UN peacekeeping missions. This topic is part of the course BGP 003 Conflict and Peace Management. Thank you so much for listening this lecture. Again we will meet in some other session. Thank you.